We talk about the Federal Reserve front-loading interest rate hikes. And every time you and I catch up, I think it's worth reminding everybody who follows this story, the original front-loaders were not the Federal Reserve and the ECB and the Bank of England. The original front-loaders of monetary policy and interest rate hikes came from emerging markets. Yeah. First question, are you going to be the first to cut as well?
You know, this is a discussion that fascinates me. Earlier on in your conversation, you were talking about a Harvard professor who was talking about interest rates being high for longer. And one of the things I always start my conversation with is, can we look and say how persistent has inflation is? Because that is the point of departure. And so far, inflation had actually been more persistent than we had initially thought. We have had a few readings where you had surprises. Just in my own country, in South Africa, we thought inflation was on a downward trajectory. It hit the low of 4.7, and before we knew it, it turned again before it went down. So inflation is more persistent. So if we want to know, want to look at which central banks are going to cut first, it's going to be those that have succeeded in bringing inflation down to target, or at the very least the ones with a lot more policy room. And you have seen that the early cutters this time around has also been the Latin American central banks that had very high real interest rates. They had that space, and that is what you should be looking at. In the case of South Africa, our real rates are not particularly high, and inflation has come down. It's within a target, but it is not quite where we would like to see it. And if we are to make any policy adjustments, we would have to see that inflation has declined to our anchor, which is 4.5%.
Has something changed, do you think? Has something changed domestically or in the international economy with regards to inflation since the pandemic?
Well, it's going to be an interesting call because I think that globally, central banks have underestimated the extent of the constraints that we face in the supply chains. Those have eased to an extent, but inflation is still stubbornly high, and that for rates to be eventually conquered, we are going to have to keep rates higher for longer. I think that more importantly is that we are faced with something that, even in the case of South Africa, we hadn't seen. A public that is increasingly intolerant of high inflation. And that is what, for me, is a big change. And central banks, which in the earlier days were questioned about why are you so aggressive, why are you front-loading, they are now being criticized for not having done enough to rein in inflation.
We say a lot of times Jerome Powell is bankrupt to the world, and I always feel bad for everybody else in the world who actually is doing policy for all of their specific countries. But is that the truth, that Jerome Powell, until he cuts rates, you won't get the all clear to cut rates because of the currency differential and because of the fear of devaluation?
A great central banker he is. He is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, not the Federal Reserve of the world. And I have got no doubt that when he makes decisions, he and his colleagues make decisions, they make decisions based on the dynamics and the outlook of the United States economy. And that, for me, is very important. I think that in our case, yes, the U.S. is a big economy. We are a small, open economy. We watch what the U.S. does, but we do not necessarily follow the U.S. in every move that they did. And case in point that Jonathan was raising was in 2021, when we saw that inflation was creeping up and there was a narrative amongst the advanced economies that it was a temporary phenomenon. We took a view that as emerging markets, been there before, seen it before, it's time that we act. And I'm glad that we acted at that time because we were able to start moving towards target much earlier than the advanced economy central banks.
The fact that you were an early sort of seer of what was going to come makes it really interesting to me that you're much more reluctant to signal cuts than over in the United States. And I'm wondering, do you agree with the Ken Rogoff view of the world, that essentially because of higher deficits and stickier inflation due to the supply chain disruptions that you were just talking about in response to John's question, that rates have to remain higher for a much longer period of time?
I would take it further. It's not just deficits. Look at the levels of public debt across the world. And these levels have got to be brought down. And one of the things that had happened historically was to almost inflate the debt away, allow inflation to erode the debt, but you have got a public that is intolerant of high inflation. So that is not an option that is actually available for the treasuries. Two, you have got treasuries globally that had been addicted to very cheap money. That era of cheap money is gone, and many treasuries are finding that they are borrowing at rates that are significantly higher than what they were borrowing at before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And third is that even in that space, what you are having is that you have got a whole generation of the public that had known only low inflation and low interest rates. And now inflation has risen and interest rates had to rise. And so you have got to rein in inflation because they are intolerant of inflation. And so you will see interest rates being higher for longer until the battle on the inflation front has been won.
We've got about a minute left with you, so let's do something provocative. You introduced the topic, though, not me. Sometimes governments make life harder for monetary policy officials. I believe there's a budget coming up, and I'm wondering domestically what you'll be looking for in that budget in South Africa.
Well, I like returning the favour. If the Minister of Finance was sitting here and you asked him what he expects of the central bank, he was going to say that he doesn't venture into that. So I don't venture into that. But they have pronounced...
Christine Lagarde does politics. Why not?
They had... well, you see, some of these central bankers might have been politicians before. I haven't been.
True.
So,
okay, carry on.
Yes, but I think that there had been a pronouncement from the South African National Treasury to set the fiscal policy on a sustainable path. I have got no reason to second guess them. I have got every reason that if they had made a commitment, they will meet that commitment. But fiscal policy is not going to be easy this year. There are more than 60 countries going for elections.
I know. It's a massive year for elections.
So it's not going to be easy.
That was
to make
the diplomatic response I expected.